Every school textbook says Christopher Columbus discovered America. But 1,000 years ago, on the frozen edge of the known world, a young man from Greenland sailed into the unknown and found a land of forests, wild grapes, and rivers full of salmon. He called it Vinland. His name was Leif Erikson, and history buried his story for nearly 1,000 years. To understand Leif Erikson, you first have to understand where he came from. And that means starting with his father, a man whose temper shaped the destiny of an entire family. Erik Thorvaldsson was born in Rogaland, Norway, around 950 CE. He would later be known as Erik the Red, a nickname he earned during his youth because of his red hair. But his life in Norway did not last long. When Erik was just 10 years old, his father Thorvald was banished from Norway for committing acts of manslaughter, and the family was forced into exile in Iceland. It was there, in the harsh volcanic landscape of the North Atlantic, that young Erik grew up. After Thorvald's death, Erik married a woman named Theodild and built a farm in a place called Haukedalr. But Erik inherited more than just his father's red hair. He inherited his troubles. Like his father before him, Erik found himself exiled, first, after his servants caused a landslide that destroyed a neighbor's farm, and then after the violence that followed. Erik and the men who sided with him were outlawed from Iceland for 3 years. Now here is where the story takes a turn that would change everything. Most men, banished and broken, would have given up. Erik the Red did the opposite, leaving around 982, from one of the westernmost points of Iceland, Erik and a small group of men sailed west and reached the opposite shore of Greenland. He spent his exile exploring that massive, icy land, and when his banishment ended, he went back to Iceland with a plan. Erik returned with stories of a place he deliberately called Greenland, because, in his own words, people would be attracted to go there if it had a favorable name. It was one of history's greatest acts of marketing. Erik's salesmanship worked. He returned to Greenland in the summer of 985 with a large fleet, though of the 25 ships that left Iceland, only 14 arrived safely. Initially, there were 400 to 500 settlers, and the colony would never grow beyond 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants. It was in this remote, wind-swept corner of the world, at the family estate of Brattahlid on the coast of Greenland, that Erik the Red raised his children. He had 3 sons, Leif, Thorvald, and Thorstein, and a daughter named Freydis. Leif Erikson was born around 970 CE, likely in Iceland, before the family moved to Greenland. And from his earliest days, the boy was shaped by the sea. In Greenland, Erik was elected the people's leader, which left little time for his son, so Leif was mostly taught and raised by one of Erik's trusted followers, a man named Turka. Think about that for a moment. The boy who would one day reach a continent unknown to all of Europe was raised not by his famous father, but by a foster father, on the very edge of the inhabited world. Leif grew up hearing stories of the ocean, of lands beyond the horizon, of ancestors who had sailed from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland. Every generation in his family had pushed farther into the unknown, and something inside Leif told him the journey was not over. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif made a voyage that would set everything in motion. He sailed from Greenland to Norway, where King Olaf I converted him to Christianity. According to the sagas, the king then commissioned Leif to return to Greenland and convert the settlers there. It was a mission that gave Leif purpose. But it was what he heard, before or during that return, that gave him a destination. You see, there was another man in this story, a man history barely remembers. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, an Icelandic explorer believed to be the first known European to sight the mainland of the Americas around 986 CE. In the summer of 986, Bjarni had sailed home to Iceland to visit his father, only to discover that his father had joined Erik the Red and sailed to Greenland. Determined to find him, Bjarni set out for Greenland, but he carried neither map nor compass, and when a massive storm hit, he was blown far off course. When the clouds finally cleared, he spotted land, but it was nothing like what he expected. The coastline was covered with trees and mountains, and although his crew begged him to stop and explore, Bjarni refused. He was eager to reach Greenland to see his parents. He sailed past 3 separate unknown coastlines without ever stepping ashore. Historians believe those lands were Newfoundland, Labrador, and Baffin Island. Bjarni was sharply criticized and lost some honor for failing to explore the new lands he had seen. But his story spread, and one person listened more carefully than anyone else. Roughly 15 years later, Leif approached Bjarni, purchased his ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and mounted an expedition towards the lands Bjarni had described. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. Leif Erikson intended to find what Bjarni had seen and refused to explore. Leif's father, Erik the Red, was supposed to join the voyage, but on the way to the ship, Erik fell from his horse, an incident he interpreted as a bad omen, and turned back. So the son sailed without the father. And that single decision split their fates forever. Leif and his crew first landed in an area that was flat and covered in rocks and glaciers. He named this region Helluland, meaning land of flat rocks, believed to be modern-day Baffin Island. It was barren, useless for settlement. So they continued south. They reached what is believed to be present-day Labrador, an area covered in trees and white sands. Leif named it Markland, or Forestland. Still they kept going. They continued further south until they came to an island where the area was green with trees bearing sweet wild grapes. They built houses and spent winter there in a place Leif named Vinland, or Wineland. They found an abundance of salmon and grass that would be good for cattle. Leif divided his crew. Half would stay with the houses and do work. The other half would explore the land. At one point, his foster father Turka found an area thriving with grapevines. The land was generous: timber, fish, wild wheat, and grapes far beyond anything Greenland could offer. But here is the thing about Leif Erikson that separates him from so many other explorers. Even in this paradise, Leif longed for his homeland. In less than a year, he returned to Greenland. He did not try to conquer. He did not try to claim everything for himself. He explored, he named what he found, and then he went home. And on that return voyage, something happened that would earn Leif the nickname he would carry for the rest of his life. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, when they were close enough to see the mountains of Greenland, Leif spotted a group of men stranded on a small rock far off the coast. He rescued them and brought them safely home. Those grateful men gave him the name Leif the Lucky. Shortly after Leif's return, his father Erik the Red died. Erik passed around 1003 CE during a winter epidemic that ravaged the colonies. The old explorer, the man who had sailed from Norway to Iceland to Greenland, was gone. And now the son who had sailed even farther had to come home and lead. When Erik the Red died, Leif Erikson took over as chief of the Greenland settlement. Leif never returned to the lands of North America. He spent the remainder of his life in Greenland. Though his father proved unreceptive to the new faith, Leif was able to convert his mother, Thjodild, who had Greenland's first church built at Brattahlid. Leif represented a new generation, one that looked outward, that embraced change, that dared to go beyond what their fathers had known. After Leif, his brother Thorvald led another expedition to Vinland, but all future efforts to settle in the region failed due to clashes between the Norsemen and the local native population. Thorvald himself lost his life in a skirmish. The Vikings did not manage to establish any permanent settlements in North America. The dream of Vinland slowly faded. The settlements in Greenland endured for centuries, surviving for about 500 years before mysteriously disappearing. Theories range from conflicts, overgrazing, plagues, or colder weather. And then came the silence. For hundreds of years, Leif Erikson's voyage existed only in the Icelandic sagas, oral stories that were told through the generations and eventually written down. The saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, both thought to have been written around 1200 CE, contain detailed but sometimes conflicting accounts. These sagas are generally regarded as works of literature rather than purely historical accounts, with scholars debating their factual accuracy. For centuries, mainstream history did not take them seriously. Columbus remained the hero. Leif Erikson remained a legend, possibly just a myth. Then in 1960, everything changed. George Decker, a resident of the fishing hamlet of Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, led Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad to a group of mounds near the village that the locals called the Old Indian Camp. The grassy mounds looked like the remains of houses. Helge and his wife, archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad, carried out 7 archaeological excavations from 1961 to 1968, finding the remains of 8 buildings. They determined the site was Norse from the characteristics of its structures and artifacts, compared to sites in Greenland and Iceland from around 1000 say.